My guest today is CTS coach Cliff Pittman. Cliff has been an endurance athlete from a young age, competing nationally in both track and cross country through high school before enlisting in the military. While he's new to our coaching team, Cliff has been coaching endurance athletes for over a decade and became a full-time trail and ultra coach in 2019. I brought Cliff on today to talk about training and racing for mountainous and higher altitude races. We cover what we are both working on with athletes ahead of big fall ultras, what mistakes we've made or see our athletes make, and how athletes can best prepare themselves for this style of racing, including the panic that sets in 4 to 6 weeks out. I really enjoyed this conversation with Cliff, and I hope you do too. Cliff, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I think you're new for this audience. I don't think I've had you on any of the round tables yet. So welcome. It's going to be fun. We're going to have a fun conversation today, I think. But because you're new to this audience, I'm wondering if you can just introduce yourself to them, formal, informal, whatever you want the audience to know about you.
Yeah, I don't know how to do formal, so we'll keep it informal. But my name's Cliff Pittman. I'm a CTS coach, and I tend to specialize in ultra running. That's my focus and what I have a passion for. Been coaching in some capacity for a little over a decade, but been fortunate enough to do it full time for the last 5 years or so, and really within the ultra scene for the last 3 years. And then I am new to CTS though, so that has been a really fun transition over the last few months, is to join the team and be able to learn from a lot of brilliant coaches that we have.
Yeah, we've got a cool coaching staff. That's why I came to CTS, was I wanted that education. I wanted some other people in my corner so that when I didn't know the answer, someone would, right? That's kind of
Yes.
the whole idea. I think we use a lot of team think. Well, welcome to CTS. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I sent you this topic and I said, we're in the thick of the season, right? Like High Lonesome just happened. Never Summer just happened. Hard Rock just happened, kind of classic big mountain races. There are Mont Blanc 90K was supposed to happen in Europe. It got canceled due to weather. We've got Wasatch, Leadville, Fat Dog 120, Grindstone, all these kind of, the mountains are open. Snow has melted. It's, kind of peak mountain season, maybe after a flatter spring. And so we've got some people that are probably starting to panic a little bit as their A fall race comes up. And I'm wondering what you have athletes getting ready for right now.
Yeah, you bet. And so I'm sure there's, a lot of people that might be listening right now that have Leadville here in a few weeks. And so maybe there's some panic associated with that. And I've got one athlete that's preparing for Leadville. He lives in Kansas, and so that's fun. I've got an athlete preparing for the Bear 100. And so we're still a good, I think 8 weeks out from that one. He lives a van life. And so there's no barriers in terms of training.
Yeah.
His mobile camp is at Flagstaff. So we live high, train low, and it's, been a lot of fun. I've got an athlete preparing for UTMB, and hopefully I can even say this right, Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. So the 100K. And so, that one starts at 5,000, ends at sea level. He lives at sea level, and on the weekend travels to Mexico City and trains up at 7,000 plus. And then got an athlete preparing for Bigfoot 200. That's right around the corner.
That is right around
really
the corner.
Close. And
Very close. Not this week, next week, I think, right?
Yep, that's correct. He lives in Iowa, and so that's probably, of all the athletes that I have coming up to be racing at altitude, that's been probably one of the biggest challenges, just because not only do we not have mountains nearby, but it's just no technical terrain whatsoever. So
yeah, and we're gonna dive into that, right? Kind of what are the limiting factors here? And I love it. I grew up in the Midwest. I live out in the Pacific Northwest now, but I think it's, I have all kinds of Midwesterners or people from folks from the South, people who live in big urban sprawls in Europe as well, who, the terrain in their backyard does not look like the terrain they're racing on. And that presents a specific form of challenges that we're going to talk about. I think I told you that I have 4 individuals in UTMB, and of the 4 of them, 1 lives in mountainous terrain. Which is a huge issue. So besides the technicality or lack of altitude, as we kind of both pointed out there with athletes, what other challenges do you see for athletes as they approach this style of racing?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just the fear of the unknown. And, we see it so often with an athlete that goes to a new distance. They've run a 50-mile before, but they're preparing for 100. And it's just like, well, I just don't know how my body's going to respond at mile 70 or 80 or 90 just because I don't have that experience. And that's kind of the same thing. Mountains are intimidating, altitude's intimidating, and there's a big fear of the unknown that creates this lack of confidence, I think,
Yeah.
on how we're going to respond. And so that's really the big challenge, is just being able to talk through that and being able to say, okay, this is how we can prepare, and this is how we can increase confidence, and this is how theoretically you should respond. And yeah, but I think that's the biggest thing. Um, I think the other thing is just maybe a little bit of not employing a ton of strategies throughout the whole training cycle. If we have 6 months to prepare for a race, well, a lot of these people want to jump in an altitude tent right off the bat. And it's like, well, um, let's discuss that later on. There's some other things that we can do. Let's see if that's a good idea. But right now, let's just get as fit as possible. Um,
Yeah,
so I
100%.
think those are some of the biggest challenges, like idleness. Like, well, why am I not adapting right now?
Yeah, I think I love the point about feeling like not underprepared, but the unknown kind of drives that sensation that we could be underprepared. And I think even those who live in the mountains, feel that way when it's a new distance or going to be new terrain for them. I mean, I'm afraid of a flat 100, to be honest, because I don't know what it feels like to like Javelina sounds terrifying to
Or a
me because
track.
yeah, what does it mean to run for that long?
Yeah.
Like, I've never done that before. I really like hiking. But obviously, every race presents its own challenges. And then I think you're right, that point about I've got athletes who, months and months and months out are like, I need to get vert in. I need to get vert in right now.
Right.
I'm like, okay, slow down. It's going to be okay. Trying to instill confidence in their fitness, instill confidence in them being healthy, instill confidence in building that fitness, I think all of a sudden becomes, mission critical. And now, I've got a bunch of athletes for UTMB, for Harikana, for these kind of fall ultras where it's like, okay, like now we're in vert season. Now we're in final prep specificity season. But you're right. It's kind of like, let's get you as fit as possible first.
Yep.
And then layer in those long runs that are, more mission critical, those that, making a camp or a trip out to get more sustained vert or some downhill in their legs. And I think that's one that comes up time and time again for me with athletes is that, the tallest thing in their city is a bridge. And they're wondering how many, I've had an athlete who the tallest thing in their city was a dam, and he would run repeats on the dam, and that made him confident. And that's, we leaned into that for sure. But for athletes that don't have these long sustained downhills or uphills, that seems to be kind of the question I get the most from athletes is like, how am I going to prepare for those long climbs? And I'm wondering if you've taken any tactics with athletes who either are terrain limited, be it race specificity or just like they don't have as much vert in their backyard. They're in Florida, they're in Wisconsin, they're in Iowa, they're in Kansas. What can we do for those athletes, or what have you done for those athletes to try to prepare them for those sustained or repeated climbing and descending that we see in these races?
Yeah, you bet. I think that goes right back to what we just talked about, and something we can probably, with looking at the outline that you sent over, like every answer is like get fit, right? Like fitness makes everything
100%
better.
fitness first.
And so just kind of talking through how that translates, like the fitter you are, the more you're going to be able to problem solve and be able to work through these issues on the course. And you can be slightly underprepared in one aspect of specificity. And if we have enough fitness, that can really make up for it and go a long ways. But I think as far as specific strategies, if we have enough time to plan out, and if we do a long range plan that's, say 6 months out for one of these events, then we can start circling weekends on the calendar when it's an ideal time to get out to the mountains, get out to, even if it's not, if someone's racing Leadville, if they can't get out to Colorado, well, what's the next best thing regionally for you? And then the third is like, well, what's the third best thing that you have, in your area, like you talked about with the bridge, or I've had an athlete that did the exact same thing in a parking garage, and it's just up and down a parking garage, with the ramps. And so I think it's just a matter of getting creative. To yes, there's the physiological adaptation there, but there's also the psychological component of, okay, I feel better because I had this training intervention that checked the box, even if it wasn't apples to apples. But I think the big thing is just getting out to the mountains if you can, 4 to 6 weeks out or 7 weeks out, and planning that 3-day training camp, or finding a B race and experiencing altitude, experiencing the mountains, so that you can say like, okay, I know exactly what I'm getting into.
Yeah, I think that's really really important. And I think if you're signed up for a goal, and this is going to kind of tie into our next topic, if this is the race that you have wanted to do, it's that UTMB or whatever it is, where it's taken time to get into the race. Maybe you don't know if you're going to get in again. Like trying to dedicate a weekend here or a weekend there to bump into some more mountainous terrain, I think can go such a long way. I just have 2 of my Texans in UTMB. I've got
Nice.
2 Texas guys, and they both went to different Colorado races this past weekend, or I guess 2 weekends ago now, to get in kind of a long day on their feet, to get in, to get their quads sore, to have that experience of being, 8 or 10 hours into something. Because I do think that one, there's that physiological component. That's a pretty good time out from race day. But at the same time, the other part of that is it's confidence, right? Yes. It's like, I feel confident in my preparation. I feel confident in my prep. I feel confident in my fitness and my ability to troubleshoot. And so I think that's really, that at the end of the day, you're right. Being fit is kind of being fit and being healthy are kind of the two big ones that I preach to my athletes as well. So I'm glad that's something that we're all doing. That's good. Yeah. That's good. We're on the same page. The next piece of that puzzle. Oh, I guess one question before we jump into the next kind of big issue for a lot of these athletes is, have you utilized, or have, like personally or with athletes, utilized strength as kind of, obviously we've got athletes doing repeats on bridges and, parking garages and that kind of thing. But what about, are they doing anything in the weight room to build that confidence outside of running, if they have the time and capabilities to do that?
Right. So I would say probably about 75 to 80% of my athletes do strength work. But I wouldn't say that any of the athletes that I've worked with have used that as a specific training intervention for the specific adaptations for improving downhill running. Maybe as we get into that phase where it's sport specific with the strength training, then we might add some eccentric strength training in there to, that nice little bump. But that really gets pretty far away from specificity, and maybe those adaptations translate, maybe they don't. But the best thing we can do is right, yeah, exactly. The best thing we can do is find the adaptations in running and the specific mode that we're going to be utilizing on race day. So I've tended to kind of shy away from that and don't want to overpromise an athlete that, okay, yes, if you do these specific exercises eccentrically, it's going to translate to better downhill running.
Yeah, I feel like that's just another thing that we're adding to be like, well, maybe this could help. I think another thing I've seen a lot of athletes do, pre-pandemic, it was a little bit easier depending on where they live as far as gym access, but man, the Nordic track treadmills have gotten pretty good. Yeah. I think I'm allowed to drop brand name there, but it's like to be able to crank it up to, pretty steep inclines and do sustained hiking on them. It's great for athletes that are injured. But I've seen athletes living in particularly like the Midwest or like kind of the South and Southeast in the US, or it's the winter and they're training for a hilly spring race where they can't run on vert for whatever reason. I know I found that living in Bozeman, Montana for a long time, couldn't run any vert in the winter because everything was snow. You had to ski. Getting on a treadmill and getting on an incline treadmill seems to be once again, is it the most specific thing? Maybe, maybe not. But having that in your back pocket of like, oh, well, I've been on the treadmill and I can hike. I've been able to hike for 30 minutes or 60 minutes in a row seems to, I think, prompt some of that confidence and some of that. I think it can get fairly specific, which is nice for an athlete.
That's such a good point. And, even throw on the vest, carry all your mandatory gear, load it up with your fluids and your nutrition and get a feel for, that weight and get on the treadmill and crank that thing up. So, yeah.
I wouldn't advise bringing your poles on the treadmill. Let's say it's good. It's good for practicing a power hike without poles.
Yeah.
I definitely would not bring your poles on the treadmill, but that I think your gym will definitely be really upset if you show up with your running poles to get on the treadmill.
I heard this rumor about this outdoor treadmill that has like rocks and everything in the belt, but that could be one of those, spoof things too. So who knows?
That's cool. Right? There are like treadmill climbing walls essentially, right?
Yeah.
We've used those in the lab. Before, but also there's a number of bouldering and climbing gyms that have those for endurance work too, which feels like you're on a wall that never ends.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
Exactly.
Man, we'll do weird stuff to try to be prepared and confident for things is kind of what I get out of these conversations. Yes. And I'm like, if anyone is listening who's new to ultras, they're also going to think we're insane.
Right.
The other piece of the puzzle, besides being worried about the vert and worried about the climbing and descending, is obviously not every mountainous race is at extreme elevation, but, oftentimes those things go hand in hand. Even modest elevation can seem really intimidating. Whenever we ran camps out of Colorado Springs for trail and ultra runners, everyone thought that they were going to be the slowest. Everyone thought that they were going to be the worst at altitude. And it turns out, altitude is hard for a lot of people many times, and we can get in our heads about it. But you mentioned you've got one athlete living in a van. That's pretty cool. That gives them a lot of flexibility for going out early, for staying at altitude, etc. But what about for, what else are we working with here when we've got athletes who maybe don't have that flexibility when it comes to getting out at an ideal time pre-race?
Yeah, I think one of the most elementary things that we can do that often gets overlooked when preparing for any extreme environment is just having RPE, rate of perceived exertion, very dialed in. Because, your heart rate zones, your pace zones, all of that goes out the window with all the variables at, physiological and technological variables at altitude. But, if you get RPE 5 dialed in, then RPE 5 is the same at 14,000 feet as it is at sea level. It's the same at 110 degrees as it is at 30 degrees. And so just, learning how to be really in tune with your effort and being able to train by RPE, having that really well calibrated, and then being able to translate that on race day when you get into the mountains. I think that's probably one of the most elementary things that we can do, and it's non-scientific, right? And it's really hard, like for athletes that have, like for myself, a track background. Like that was really hard for me to transition to RPE when I got on the trails. But it makes sense. Like cyclists, right? You have the most precise measurement of output with power. Like, you want me to go based off how I feel? It's a hard transition for a lot of athletes, but it's so important to be able to properly manage your effort when you're in extreme environments. And that's especially true at altitude.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a really, really valid point, because our other answer would be like, well, fitness
right.
comes first. But the RPE thing is a really great thing to lean back into, because you're right. RPE 5 is going to be RPE 5 no matter where you are, because it's based on how you feel at that intensity. So that is something to definitely pay attention to when getting to altitude. The other thing that I thought could be useful for athletes, and as I mentioned, my Texas guys who just went out to Colorado, we kind of had the double whammy there. We got in a practice race. We got in a practice race that had vert, and we got in a practice race that took them to altitude so they could experience, like, what does it feel like to eat and drink at elevation? Mm-hmm. What does it feel like when I show up, maybe an unideal time, maybe 48 hours pre-race or 72 hours pre-race, a little bit kind of that in-between zone that we try to avoid, or even the day before, kind of building that confidence, or at least getting ready to troubleshoot in that environment. You mentioned an altitude tent earlier with athletes kind of being, chomping at the bit to utilize technology like that. Is there anything that you have advised athletes to do or not to do? Or is it real? I mean, it's obviously very individual when it comes to altitude prep and what the athlete is available to them, but I'm kind of curious if there's anything else besides that kind of RPE, like really leaning into that you might advise an athlete to do pre-race at higher elevation.
Yeah, you bet. So the first thing is just exactly what you mentioned with the training camp or the B race is getting out to altitude in advance. Another thing is the race specific strategies. So are you going to arrive super early? Are you able to get there a week out? How high is the race? That is going to determine how early you need to get out there. And if you can't, because not everybody can, then, maybe it's best that we fly in the night before or we get there the morning of, and hopefully we can avoid that window, that 24 to 72 hour window where your body really starts to go through those adaptations, and you feel, sick. So I think that just the timing of it all, which is something that we should, really plan out far in advance before we have, our travel itinerary nailed down, to kind of know, okay, it goes back to the confidence piece too, right? Like, well, if I know that I'm going to get there 10 days in advance, I can kind of just file away this whole adapting to altitude throughout the training process, focus on getting fit, work into the specifics when the timing is right. I know that I'm going to get there in time for my body to adapt to the stress of altitude, so I don't have to worry about that so far out.
Yeah, I think it's that there's a big psychological component to altitude and to heat. I think with a lot of athletes, like acclimation is a real thing. Physiological changes do take place when you're exposed to those extreme environments, but I think a lot of us really get in our head and we say, oh, I'm always bad at altitude. I'm always bad in the heat. And it's like, okay, well, that's not going to set us up for success at all. So I think spending more time out there, if possible, either early ahead of the race or via those training camps, I think helps to promote some of that, changing the narrative of, oh, I'm bad at X, Y, or Z. So I think that is important for us to remember. A lot of us learn from experience. Some of us, I would say that most of us in the ultra world definitely learn from experience. Right. Outside of education, that's kind of what you have to adapt and grow from. And so I'm wondering, as you work with athletes, what personal experiences you might be drawing from as far as making mistakes when it comes to showing up to a mountainous race or showing up to a race that's at more moderate to higher elevation.
Yeah. I think just the magnitude of how much our sweat rate or how many fluids we need to drink is impacted. If we think about just the kidneys are working overtime, the extra urination, the increased respiration, the cool, dry air might dry the sweat a little bit, faster. We're down here in the humidity in the south. It's like, well, we know how much we're sweating, because it's not going anywhere. So that's kind of a personal example that I just learned from one of my athletes that I didn't drive home. Hey, you're going to have to intake additional fluids to account for these changes in the sweat rate, and he ended up taking in less because he didn't think he was sweating as much, didn't think he needed it. So that was just a few weeks ago at the last call 50s, and that's at Fair Play. That's like 10,000 feet, just right there next to Leadville, and so we learned a valuable lesson that we're going to take into Leadville, and it was a good learning experience. But definitely something as a coach that I've got to drive home of, like, this is what to expect. We've got a sweat rate dialed in at 100 degrees. It's likely going to be the same thing, whenever you get up to altitude.
Yeah, I like that. Mistakes are good.
Yeah, that's how we learn.
We hate for them to happen during A races. That's why B races are a wonderful idea. But yeah, I remember rolling into my first 100 was Leadville. And as one does, my first 100 was Leadville. And I was convinced that I could eat a bunch of things that I definitely could not eat. And I was like, I didn't know I wouldn't have saliva. I was taking like handfuls of Skittles down the trail and they would just ball up in my mouth. And so really trying to find, you're right. Like everything dries out a lot quicker up there. And so I think there are these little things. I've also had a lot of athletes now, and this is not like, I feel like this could be fear mongery, but I've had a lot of athletes now at higher, drier races, have things like their throat hurts after a certain point. Like eating becomes really hard because you've been ventilating, you've been breathing a lot in this really dry air. Maybe it's dusty or maybe it's cold, and all of a sudden you kind of have these other things that you have to troubleshoot through. That after you've done it for the first time, you're like, oh right, like my throat might hurt at a certain point. So like, I brought a ton of lozenges to Badwater. It's not very high at Badwater, but it's really dry and it's really warm. And I knew from running Tahoe Rim Trail, running Leadville, like at some point, like my athlete's throat was going to like start to kill him. And so I had my baggie of lozenges ready to go because, I've witnessed these things happen. So I think, it can be intimidating if it's your first high altitude race or your first mountainous race. But, that's the learn from the mistakes. I've got an athlete right now where I was like, go find all the old race reports for this race. Read some old race reports from people who had or have blogs. Absolutely. Because they're gonna tell you the mistakes they made for the most part, because ultra running is riddled with them. So I think that's kind of I hope should be kind of confidence inspiring or boosting for those listening, just because I think it's easy to worry that you're going to make mistakes, and the truth of the matter is like you're likely going to. Yep. So try to learn from your friends or your trail community about what mistakes they made. Say, what did you not know going into this race, and what could I avoid? I found at Leadville too, at a certain point, I couldn't run and eat at the same time. I needed too much oxygen to do either of those things. So there's a photo of me somewhere standing at the top of Hope Pass eating a oatmeal cream pie because I could not hike and consume food at the same time because I needed to breathe. So I would say, go easy on yourself and recognize walking in, you're probably going to make mistakes, and that is okay because it's going to make the next one that much better. And I think kind of, one of the reasons why I pinged you and pinged coaches for this conversation was, I've got a bunch of athletes who are looking at races, 4, 6, 8 weeks out right now. And that's the time where you really, I think, start to panic. You start to question, like, how am I possibly going to be ready for this race in only 6 weeks? I feel that way about fall racing right now too. And so I'm wondering, what are you telling athletes? What can we tell athletes listening to this, to ease those fears and or be like, just, kind of check these boxes in the next month or two, and you're going to be okay.
Yeah. Go make some mistakes, right? Like get yourself in a situation. If you can get out to the mountains or similar, get yourself in a situation where you can accumulate some personal experience and learn, so that you have more tools in your tool belt to strategize for race day. More experience, those mistakes that you make that we just talked about. This is the ideal time to get out and do that. You're 4 to 6 weeks out. This is the time to go out and do a training camp. I think, for example, the athlete that I'm working with that's racing Leadville, he did the last call 50s, 6 weeks out. And then 4 weeks out, he came here he wasn't able to go back to Colorado, so he came here where I live in Northwest Arkansas in the Ozark Mountains. So like, if you're listening to the audio version of this, I just did air quotes for mountains because they're not, they're nothing like, a lot of the larger mountains around the United States. But anyways, he was able to come out and get very similar like training without the altitude, but with 105 degree heat index. And he was able to still get 7-mile climbs and 7-mile descents on gravel mountain roads, which he ended up getting more climbing and descending than he will get at Leadville. So that worked out well for him to come out here and have a 3-day training camp. And I got to connect with him, which was great, support him out there. But I think that if you're 4 to 6 weeks out right now and you're like, oh, I've got to be real productive with this time frame, do your best to get out and make some mistakes, learn from them, go into your race more knowledgeable with that personal experience, and start problem solving now. I think that's something that, I like to tell my athletes, like the week of race, like, okay, this week we're going to do as much problem solving as we can before the race, so that if we've imagined every, negative possible outcome, on race day, then we've already imagined it and we've already problem solved for it. Then that's less mental, hamster wheel that you're on, trying to spin the wheel on race day, trying to problem solve. And just that confidence, it always comes back to confidence, I think. If we have the confidence on race day to say, okay, if this happens, I can work through it. Something happens that I haven't thought of, I know that I can work through it, which is like my definition of confidence. It's not having all the answers. It's just a belief in yourself that you can work through it and that you can get to the point where you find the answer.
Yeah. And then I think the only thing I'll add to that is, I think it's really easy to get hung up on, did I do the one long run I was really supposed to do? Or did I do the one workout that really mattered type of thing? And I try to remind athletes that, once again, kind of going back to that fitness piece, like you're a summation of all of the training you've done. There's not a key workout that's going to make or break your race. It's not going to be, I had to get this back-to-back in, or I had to get this long steady state run in, or whatever it might be. Like, you are a summation of all the training that you've done, and that, don't get hung up in the next 4 to 6 weeks on, things being perfect, because you've been putting in months of training. The hay has been piling high in that barn for a long time.
Probably
now.
years.
We're just trying to stuff just a little bit more in, right? Like we're in the minuscule, like, last bale or two of hay in the last 4 to 6 weeks, given your athletic history. So
it's never going to be perfect
really,
anyways, right? It's never going to be perfect.
No, it's not. Oh my goodness. That is a fallacy.
Yes.
Balance and perfection are both fallacies. Awesome. Okay. Is there anything else that you would like that you don't think that we addressed, or that you think athletes might have concerns about?
I think that we can just drive home that point of, what you were saying of, like, the accumulation of just all the training that you've done throughout this training cycle, but really over the years, and just lean on the experience. Whatever experience you have, it doesn't necessarily have to be ultra running. Like, lean on experiences that you have in life, because I guarantee you, if you're listening to this, you've overcome something significant, and it doesn't have to be in a race. You've overcome something significant, and you have a reason to be confident, and you have a reason to be proud of yourself. And even if your fitness isn't where you want it to be, and you feel that you haven't checked all the boxes that you want to check, that's okay, because you can get out into an environment like this and you can figure it out. You can find your way through it, even with some things that you feel aren't right with, your training. And that's totally okay. It happens all the time when people show up and they're not fully prepared, and they put out a really masterful performance and they surprise themselves.
That's perfect. That's your pep talk, folks. That's all you got. That's your pep talk. You're going to just listen to that last minute or two right before race day, and you're going to be just fine. Cliff, where can folks find you online if they want to learn more about you or more about your coaching?
So Instagram is the best place to find me. The handle is @Coach Cliff Pittman, and I'm pretty active on there.
Sweet, and we'll put those in our show notes for everyone listening as well. Cliff, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It was great to be on here.